Thank you. Yeah, welcome everybody. As you know, I'm Shreyas Jetgar, Program Manager for the Fellowship Program. Really excited for the first training in a series of trainings we'll be doing this fall for all of you fellows. This is a new feature of the Fellowship Program. To really provide an in-depth set of trainings on key topics for all of you. And it's of course intended to benefit you for your knowledge and education, but of course to help support you in implementing your projects and supporting your host institutions, and of course a benefit for the program as a whole to be more informed and prepared to hit the ground running in your fellowship. And we're starting this series of trainings today with a focus on the electricity system, because this program really does focus on the power system or the power sector, and electricity is absolutely key here. Electricity is undergoing profound transformation, and regardless of where you as a fellow sit geographically or host institution wise, or what your project is, this is really a foundational training to set you up for really anything that you're working on during this first year of the fellowship, and probably in year two as well. And we're really fortunate to have some very smart people from DOE's vast complex of national laboratories. So really thank you to Lisa and the team of presenters here for developing this training and bringing everybody together. Really wanted to just applaud people for putting in the time to develop this training and deliver it to all of you. That's all I have. I'm ready to turn it over to Paul if he's on, but I don't. Let me maybe just open up the full list here of participants, or Lisa, if you have seen if Paul is on, let me know. Otherwise, I'm happy to run through the
Yeah, I do.
slides here.
Paul is training right now.
Thank you. Hey, Paul, thanks for joining. Paul Spitzen, U.S. Department of Energy.
Excellent. Thank you.
Paul, if you'd like to say a few words, that'd be great.
Yeah, we just want to, congratulations to all the fellows that are joining and welcome you to this meeting that we're going to have. And this is kind of the first in what we're hoping is going to be a really useful series of trainings to, one, kind of get you up to speed, but also to connect you kind of with the broader lab community that the national, that Department of Energy oversees, and really kind of hopefully build out a resource set for you guys to leverage as you kind of work with your individual institutions on the back end. And so one, I just want to again acknowledge Lisa and all the different people she's brought to this. And then two, to give a flag again, as you have questions in your roles, feel free to reach out to either us or the National Lab folks. We will figure out a way to provide you with assistance. So that's just a high level welcome, and we're really excited to work with you and give you all the help that you need.
Great. Paul, would you like me to go through the agenda and the other slides now? Great.
Sure, that'd be great. Thanks, Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Schwartz with Berkeley Lab, and I'm really pleased to be here. And I'm so grateful to the Department of Energy for supporting the Clean Energy Innovator Fellows. You know, a lot of fellows have been taken on at public utility commissions, the state energy offices, and other, you know, locales following the fellowship, and that's exactly what I was hoping for. So it's a wonderful program. Next slide, please. So today for you, we have training on the basics of electricity regulation. We'll do sort of a 101 overarching presentation, then talk about the basics of cost of service rate making, which is primarily what we do today. Cost allocation, how our cost splits across customers, and then we'll cover cost effectiveness evaluation, which is used in so many different proceedings. We'll have about 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A following each presentation. Please go ahead and enter your questions at any time in the chat box, and we'll get to them following the presentation. Slides are posted at the link. We'll also put it in the chat box under the National Trainings Accordion tab below the diagram. So that's where you'll find our slides. And we'll eventually post the recording for today and other trainings in the series at that same location. Next slide, please. All right, I want to encourage you to register for the next training, which is just in a couple of weeks, which will be focusing on grid resilience. We have a really good program for you. Next slide. And we have additional topics coming up. On October 31, we have integrated resource planning, and we'll be sending a registration link for that shortly. And other topics that are coming up include distribution system planning, transportation and building electrification, equity, and a short presentation on what national labs do and how can you access our research and technical assistance. Today's training started a little earlier. All future trainings will be from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Next slide, please. All right, I wanted to give a quick pitch to our in-person regional trainings that cover integrated distribution system planning. We'll be featuring electrification and demand flexibility a bit more in the series. And we'll have 3 trainings starting in December and also occurring in March and April in different parts of the country. And you'll receive a registration announcement soon from NASIO for that first training. Next slide, please. And I just want to show you some other technical assistance and training resources. And again, these slides will be posted. I will put in the chat box a link to the slides so you can access all of these resources. All right, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first trainer, Grace Relf from Berkeley Lab. We sent out in the announcement the bios for all our trainers, so I won't take time here, but I will just highlight that Grace joined us recently from the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, where she was manager of research and policy. Grace?
Thanks, Lisa. All right, let's get some slides going. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for that nice welcome. As Lisa mentioned, my name is Grace Relf. I'm excited to be here with you all this morning to talk about the basics of electricity regulation. I am with Berkeley Lab on the Energy Markets and Policy team. And previously, I was with the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, and we actually had the pleasure of working with some really exceptional clean energy innovators. So I'm really excited to meet you all. And I hope that you'll come away this morning with a greater understanding of what regulation is and why it's important. During the presentation today, first we'll go over some basics of the power sector, and then we'll cover why utilities are regulated and what regulators do. We're going to talk through the different types of electricity markets and the players in those markets. And then we'll get into more of the nuts and bolts of how regulators do what they do and how other entities that participate in the regulatory process inform the outcomes. There's a lot of information on these slides, so I do hope that you'll take a look at them afterwards and continue to refer back to them as a resource. So first, just to start, I wanted to get a sense of how familiar folks are with utility regulation. And I know this is a very wonky subject, so no worries if you are a total beginner. Okay, awesome. I'm seeing lots of answers coming in, mostly in the middle. Seems like we have one expert out there. That's good. All right, let's give this another couple seconds. Okay, it looks like we've got all answers in. Great, so it looks like we're mostly starting from a little bit of idea of how utility regulation works, and I hope that you'll come away this morning with an even better idea of that. Okay, so now we're going to get into the power sector fundamentals and start from the beginning on this sector. At a foundational level, electricity supply and demand have to be in balance for the grid to remain stable and for it to maintain its frequency, which is a technical term for how many oscillations are in the electrical current. In order to keep everything in sync, grid operators can deploy what we call ancillary services. For example, grid operators typically have reserves or backup generation ready to go in case a power plant goes offline unexpectedly. Ancillary services also help to maintain frequency and voltage, which are characteristics of electricity. And black start capabilities is also an ancillary service. And this refers to power plants that can restart on their own without any support from the grid. And that's really helpful in case there's a bigger grid outage. Each type of generation and resource has different characteristics that impacts how it provides electricity to the grid and what kind of grid services it provides. For example, solar energy only produces energy when it's sunny, and wind energy is often even more variable than that. Other plants might produce energy more consistently throughout the day or just be used during times of peak demand. And then demand side resources like energy efficiency and demand flexibility provide very critical load reducing and shifting services. And then beyond just when energy is being produced, generators have different characteristics with regards to those ancillary services. For example, some units are not capable of starting up quickly enough to act as operating reserves, while others might be dedicated to responding to frequency changes that require a response in even less than a second. So historically, grid operators have had a few really large generators to balance, but now there are many more variable and customer-sided resources, and balancing the grid is a lot more complicated than it was. So this sector is really undergoing a big transformation that's requiring a lot of innovation, new technology, and really just gaining experience with how to operate a grid with this new resource mix. This diagram is a high-level overview of the grid, and we're starting with the section labeled number 1, generation, which is on the left, but also now with distributed energy resources, or DERs. It also happens on the far right of this diagram. There are many types of generators. Some are thermal units or power plants that use heat to produce energy, like using coal, natural gas, or nuclear fuel. Renewable energy systems run on feedstock from renewable sources like solar, wind, or geothermal. And then you could actually also have a renewable thermal unit like a power plant running on biofuels. You might also hear the terms baseload or peaking units, which refers to how the power plant is used. Baseload meaning that it serves load consistently throughout the day, and peaking meaning that it serves load at times of high demand. Customers are also becoming a much more meaningful part of the generation mix now by installing DERs, like rooftop solar, batteries, and even some electric vehicles have the potential to send electricity back to the grid. I'm sitting here in Hawaii right now where rooftop solar alone makes up between 15 and 20% of all the generation on our islands. And while that is sort of unique, it is a trend that we're seeing across the country. Once the power is generated, if it's not consumed right there, it has to be transmitted to where it's used. The transmission system operates at high voltages to be able to move power efficiently across those long distances. Transmission's a really hot topic in the industry right now, so I wanted to be sure to touch on why it's so critical. So first, of course, cities make up a really big portion of our electricity demand, but there's usually not enough physical space for cities to be able to host big energy units. Open spaces are also really great for solar and wind farms, but then it's necessary to get that electricity to where it's needed. And then second, electricity demand is growing overall for a number of reasons that we'll talk about. So we have to build new power plants to help meet that growing demand. The problem is, though, that it's really complicated to build transmission because it's really capital intensive. It often crosses multiple states, and allocating the costs for transmission can be very challenging. For that reason, the national regulator, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and players in the transmission space are working to help improve the process associated with transmission development and for getting generators interconnected to the grid more quickly than they have in the past. Next, the medium voltage distribution system gets the electricity from the transmission system to your house and to where it will be used. In order to do this, first, the electricity has to be stepped down in voltage by transformers at the substation. Then a feeder or a circuit takes the electricity out of the substation at what we call the primary distribution level before it's stepped down in voltage again to the secondary distribution level for delivery to where it gets consumed. And in addition to just this physical equipment, the distribution system also includes a lot of advanced technology that helps with monitoring the grid, keeping everything cyber secure and physically secure, and helping to operate certain systems of the certain components of the system. If you're a nerd like me, you might find it fun to actually be able to look around your neighborhood and understand what you're seeing around you and what that equipment is doing. On the left, this is a typical electricity pole setup. At the top, there are higher voltage primary distribution wires that are insulated by those little discs to ensure that the lines don't touch anything that they shouldn't. Fuses can help interrupt power flow in a circuit if needed. And transformers, as we talked about, will step the voltage down again for delivery through the secondary wires on the bottom. The really thick black lines on the very bottom of your pole are typically telecommunications equipment. At the substation, you have a number of different pieces of equipment that help to maintain the stability of the power as it goes from the transmission to the distribution system. So that's things like bus work, which helps to interconnect the equipment, circuit breakers that can interrupt power flow, voltage and capacitors, both of which help maintain appropriate voltages, and then transformers to help change the voltage. Because we always have to match supply and demand, customers are a huge component of the electrical system. And these images are intended to help give you a sense of how that electricity is used. Over time, our electricity sales have grown really dramatically, although it has been a bit slower in the past couple of decades. In the residential sector on the right, much of that electricity goes towards heating and cooling. And then those other uses that make up about 40% of our residential use go to other appliances like washers and dryers and cooking equipment and other electronics. Looking forward, there are a few interesting trends to look out for. So first is that electricity demand is expected to continue to grow. Notably, electricity used for transportation is expected to grow relatively significantly as electric vehicles take off. And then second, with the climate warming, space cooling or air conditioning is expected to make up a much bigger percentage of our residential energy use. And then those other uses kind of shift around a bit, with more electricity going to other uses like for cooking and less going towards lighting. This projected growth is driven by both new demand and also electrification of many different end uses. Electrification refers to switching from using a different fuel, like usually gas, to using electricity as your fuel, which many sectors and states are pursuing to help meet their climate goals and reduce emissions. For example, cars and vehicles are increasingly going electric, and the steel industry is projected to move more and more to use of electric furnaces for steel production. Another important trend is the shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which is becoming possible because of the costs for those energy technologies are declining. And then, of course, the government is offering incentives to help deploy those technologies as well. As one interesting example, I saw that solar energy could grow by up to 1,000% by 2050. Okay, so I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Myles, to help me get a whiteboard set up. I want to hear from you all about what topics you're working on that address these and other electric sector trends. So we're going to get that whiteboard going. And on the left side of the whiteboard, you will see a little sticky note icon. It is right below a T. And I just want to see a couple of words about what you are working on in your fellowship, maybe grid modernization or DERs or something like that as we go forward. Myles, are you able to pull up that whiteboard? Just give it 1 second.
Hi, Grace. I think it's showing for everybody right now.
Oh, perfect.
People are contributing here.
Awesome. Okay, great. I'm there as well. Okay, so this is exciting. I'm seeing a lot of grid resiliency, distribution system planning. That's a good one. Lisa mentioned lots of work going on at the lab on that one. Energy storage, lots of electrification. Ooh, islanded microgrids. That's a fun one we think a lot about here in Hawaii. Energy equity and justice. Love to see that. This is great. So lots of these trends, and yeah, this is exactly sort of, those trends that we're seeing in the sector that are really impacting how our energy is produced and how it's used. Okay, feel free to continue using this whiteboard for a moment. We'll shut it down in just a few minutes, but I'm going to head back to the slides. Okay, so aligned with many of your projects, things are also changing on the customer side of things. And this graph shows how DERs have grown over time and how they're projected to keep growing in the coming years. EV charging and batteries have had particularly strong growth in the last few years, and that's expected to continue. And then I also wanted to point out the red portion of this graph, which shows residential demand flexibility. And that refers to customers shifting their energy use to different times of day or sometimes reducing demand. This and energy efficiency are really critically important DERs as well. All in all, the grid is changing, and this transformation from a grid that historically only flowed one way from the generator to the customer to an increasingly dynamic, sophisticated two-way grid, that's called grid modernization, which I saw many of you are working on. Illustrated in this image, you'll see a couple of examples of ways that the grid is modernizing. And grid modernization as a term can refer to many things, but this includes physical infrastructure upgrades, modernizing how we operate the grid and integrate new resources, using technology to improve the cybersecurity and physical security of the grid, and helping to manage and monitor the system, and then continuing to plan for the future. Okay, here we go into regulation itself. So at its core, regulation is government oversight of an industry that has significant public impacts. Regulation works to ensure that those players in the industry are acting in a way that will serve the public's interest. In practice, serving the public interest is challenging because it requires balancing a number of objectives. And those objectives include meeting public policy requirements like renewable energy or decarbonization mandates, following economic principles like allowing market competition for certain activities or reducing market inefficiencies, protecting customers like making sure the system is safe, protecting the environment like reducing air or water pollution, and then sometimes even serving private interests like giving utilities the opportunity to remain financially viable. These can be in conflict with one another because, for example, what might help keep a utility financially viable might not be what keeps bills affordable for low-income customers. And so every day, regulators are making decisions to help optimize those different interests and find solutions that are mutually reinforcing across them. Utilities provide services that have been and that are increasingly critical for us to live healthy and safe lives. For example, broadband and telecommunication are absolutely vital to accessing emergency services and for working remotely, like many of us might be doing today. Electricity is, of course, vital for many reasons, but can be even life-sustaining for folks who use electrical medical devices or for keeping cool on really hot days. To provide those services, though, utilities have infrastructure that actually physically crosses public areas and that creates societal externalities. So, for example, pipelines run under private property, burning fuels can create air pollution, and electrical cables can obstruct your nice views. Regulation, therefore, establishes the rules of the road for these services and then works to hold utilities accountable to those standards. You might hear the phrase, all regulation is incentive regulation, which is intended to say that every action by a regulator creates some sort of motivation for the utility to act. And this could look like a mandate or a consequence for not meeting a mandate, or it could look like finding ways to encourage certain activities or behaviors. For example, some utilities are offered financial rewards for exceeding energy efficiency targets, which is called a performance incentive. And this slide shows utility industries that are commonly regulated, but the extent to which they're regulated or competitive varies by state. For example, this graph illustrates that every PUC regulates electric and natural gas utilities in some ways, but others also have special mandates to help regulate housing, transportation, or even other industries as well. Across those utilities, regulators set standards and expectations, including that utilities are obligated to serve customers in exchange for rates that will cover their costs to provide that service. This is a concept called the regulatory compact. And it's important to note that there are bounds around this concept. So utilities do not necessarily have to provide service to customers who don't pay their bills, and the level of rates that are allowed to be recovered from customers are closely scrutinized by regulators before they're approved. Another regulatory standard for utilities is that services should be provided in a way that's safe, that there's enough of it, that it's reliable, and that the rates are just and reasonable. The photo on this slide is a bunch of distribution and telecommunications wires just near my house. And I put it there to show that there's a unique nature of this industry in that it's inefficient to have multiple companies own competing electric distribution lines. And this is called a natural monopoly in economic terms. It's meaning that it is inefficient to have those multiple companies competing for the service. Utilities that own generation also have a monopoly on providing electricity to customers. In the electric sector, then, regulation is a market intervention that takes the place of competition to help ensure that monopoly utilities serve the public interest and to set prices. There are multiple levels of regulatory authority over utilities, and those different layers of jurisdiction are outlined in federal and state laws. At the federal level, the major players is FERC, which in the electric sector generally oversees anything crossing state lines or interstate commerce. This includes rates and services for interstate transmission and wholesale power sales for public utilities. In this role, FERC oversees the governance of non-discriminatory open access to the transmission system for generators that want to access it. And then it oversees the rates and terms for use of that transmission system. FERC also sees how wholesale markets are run and how the prices are set within those markets. Wholesale markets cover what we call sales for resale, which basically means that a buyer will resell the electricity that it purchases. Ultimately, another entity then will sell it to the customer. Another major part of FERC's role is setting reliability standards for the bulk power system and monitoring compliance with those standards. And they work with an organization called NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, to do that. As with FERC, the jurisdiction of state regulators is set in state law, so it will vary state by state. For those of you working at PUCs, the chapter of your state's statute that established your PUC and its authority is a really good reference tool for your work, so I recommend you pull that up. State regulators' authority typically covers identifying how much it will cost the utility to provide their service to customers, and this is called the revenue requirement, and then approving rates aligned with that are just and reasonable. Regulators may also have some authority over what resources the utility buys and its portfolio of resources, but this varies state by state and then would usually be considered separately from whether the utility can actually recover those costs. Regulators typically also oversee major financial utility transactions like a change of ownership or a merger and acquisition. And then they help to determine where and when monopolies are appropriate and make sure that utilities aren't acting in anti-competitive ways. So as one example, some utilities actually own other companies that build power plants. This would be called an affiliate company, and regulators in that case would help to make sure that utilities don't give their related company preferential treatment. The last bullet on this slide and the image on the bottom shows that in the past, regulation was really thought of as what we might call economic regulation, monitoring prices and ensuring service meets basic standards. But now in many states, there are specific policy goals that regulators have to grapple with, like looking at social impacts like clean energy and climate change goals and resilience to extreme weather. All right, next we're going to get into market structures, and this area is a bit complex because there are so many layers, but we'll walk through each of the major markets where electricity is bought and sold and discuss the major players in each. First, there are two major types of electricity sales, wholesale and retail. Wholesale transactions are just like those in any other type of market where the good is purchased in bulk and then sold to a reseller, not to the customer directly. Retail transactions are then when the electricity finally gets sold directly to the customer or end user. This graph illustrates at a high level the components of both types of transactions. So for wholesale power transactions, the key is that power resellers are buying the electricity. In a wholesale transaction, sellers are those entities that generate electricity. So power plant owners or independent companies, and utilities that own power plants, and then companies that aggregate and sell energy from DERs. Wholesale power transactions occur in multiple types of markets, including direct trading or bilateral trading, markets that operate on different timescales from real time to years in the future, and also in markets that transact only in ancillary services. Wholesale power typically moves from generators over transmission lines. On the retail side of things, buyers are the end users or the customers, and they're buying electricity from either a power reseller or directly from a power plant owner for their own use. Retail transactions happen as either sales directly to the customer, so many of you are likely buying your electricity directly from a utility, or retail electricity can also be traded bilaterally. Retail transactions can use all sections of the grid, depending on who's involved. This slide illustrates the difference between what we call a vertically integrated and a restructured or deregulated market. At a high level, this would be established in your state by law, and that would really establish the rules of the road for the market structure and who can own what and who can sell what. On the left, vertically integrated states allow utilities to own generation and sell it to customers. In these states, utilities can also purchase electricity from companies that own generation, so those independent power producers. In the middle, some states are partially deregulated, meaning that the utility is allowed to own generation, but some customers might be able to choose to get their electricity from a different provider. And then on the right, in the deregulated or restructured market, utilities are not allowed to own generation, meaning that they own and operate the infrastructure to get electricity to customers, even though the customer is purchasing it from someone else. Within each of those markets, utilities also have different ownership types. And this is important because the utility's business model really influences how it's regulated. At the top, we have IOUs. These are owned by private companies and are rate regulated by PUCs. IOUs serve the majority of load in the country, and because of their ownership model, regulators might actually have to interact with Wall Street analysts or consider shareholders because those entities play a key role in whether the utility is financially viable. Municipal utilities are owned by the local government. In most states, they're regulated by the city council or an elected commission, but in some states, they're regulated by the PUC. And their ownership model typically means that any earnings are returned back to city residents. PUDs are actual government agencies governed by a board of directors that are elected by the residents served by the utility. And co-ops or cooperatives are similar in that they're governed by an elected board of directors, but they are private nonprofit organizations. And then finally, there are some utilities that are owned by the state or federal government, by tribes or other entities. This graph illustrates that almost every PUC fully regulates IOUs. Based on these data, the only exceptions are Delaware, which has more limited authority over IOUs, and Nebraska, which is the only state as of this data in the country without any IOUs at all. For municipals and co-ops, the percentage is much lower, and the PUC, the authority of the PUC is more frequently limited in some way or another. So for example, in Indiana, the commission always has authority over which utility serves what territory, but utilities can choose to withdraw from regulation over their rates and financing. Outside of utilities, there are other participants in these energy markets. On the right, we're showing where each of these players typically shows up in those markets. So federal power marketing administrations, or PMAs, were created to market the hydroelectric power produced from federal dams, and they can also own and operate electrical systems. Community choice aggregators, or CCAs, are usually an independent company or sometimes a government entity that buys electricity on behalf of government for residents in that area. They're primarily energy resellers, operating in areas where customers can choose their electricity suppliers. Governments might choose to use a CCA because they want to use more clean energy, or they get lower prices, or some other reason as well. Generation and transmission cooperatives exist to help smaller distribution utilities gain economies of scale in the generation and transmission space. Independent power producers, or IPPs, are those companies that own power plants. They're generators that sell electricity to utilities, into wholesale markets, or directly to customers, depending on the state's market structure. Then finally, we have DER aggregators, which is a growing industry. And these are companies that work with utilities and sometimes directly with customers who have DERs like rooftop solar or batteries or water heaters that can provide grid services. And they are working to collect all those resources together and provide grid services to utilities or into markets. Within each market, there are also multiple types of transactions that utilities or other players can use to buy and sell electricity. On the wholesale side, utilities can buy and trade power directly with one another or with IPPs. So it's called a bilateral transaction. In areas where there's a regional grid operator, they're authorized by FERC to run organized wholesale markets where sellers can offer their services and buyers can purchase them. Wholesale markets usually run at different temporal levels. So there's a real-time energy trading market that supports immediate grid balancing needs, day-ahead markets to support shorter-term needs, and longer-term capacity markets where buyers can get capacity a few years in advance. On the retail side of things, utilities can sell directly to you, the customer, or customers can choose who they buy electricity from. And in that case, the utility is usually still required to provide backup service or be a provider of last resort if it's needed. The wholesale side of things can get a bit complex because there are a lot of players in the space. So just zooming out for a big picture, the country's grid actually has 3 distinct areas that operate independently, called interconnections. Within those interconnections, balancing authorities are the boots on the ground that actually balance the supply and demand of smaller grid areas. Regional transmission organizations and independent system operators, RTOs, ISOs, utilities, and other entities can all act as balancing authorities depending on the region. The RTOs and ISOs have big jobs in the bulk power system. They're responsible for making sure that the transmission system is accessible. They operate the regional grid, they run those wholesale markets, and they help to oversee the reliability of the system overall. RTOs and RSOs are functionally the same thing, but you'll usually hear them used interchangeably, but they do have slightly different technical definitions, and an RTO usually covers a larger geographic area. And FERC has jurisdiction over those qualified RTOs and ISOs because they typically include interstate commerce. The one exception is ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, which does not have any interstate commerce. So this slide shows maps of electric reliability organizations and the different RTOs and ISOs. So within each of those interconnections, there are 6 smaller regional entities that work with NERC to make sure the bulk power system, including transmission and generation, is reliable. In regions where there isn't an RTO or an ISO, the utilities typically use bilateral transactions to acquire and trade power. In the West, the California ISO also runs a real-time trading market that utilities can choose to participate in if they want to support one another in real-time grid balancing. All right, so now let's go over some of the day-to-day of what state regulators do. There are lots of different kinds of things that PUCs do. This slide shows the major types of proceedings that you'll get at a PUC, and a proceeding refers to the different types of approvals or decisions or questions that the PUC might answer. Rulemaking is an administrative process where the commission outlines how it will do its job and how the utilities will meet its expectations. Rate cases allow the commission to consider changes to what the utility charges its customers. Once decisions are made, tariffs are the formal rules of the road or the gospel on terms, conditions, and prices that the utility will use. Policy proceedings are often higher level, where the commission is looking into a more complex or emerging issue where the utility requires policy guidance. Planning proceedings help the commission oversee where the grid's going and how the utility will meet its obligation. And then finally, in some states, utilities may file an application to procure resources or commit funds to new projects or programs. And each of these types of proceedings has different processes. So some types of proceedings are much more formal and need to follow very specific rules and processes. What types of proceedings follow what process will be laid out in the state law or in your commission's rules. So for example, in all states, rate cases are considered formal because that's part of the fundamental responsibility of the commission to make sure that rates are just and reasonable. For formal proceedings, the commission can only use what's on the official record to make their decision and really can't consider anything outside of that. Regardless of the type of proceeding, though, most proceedings have some common procedural steps shown here. The first is approving requests for intervention, and this means that the commission is deciding who can weigh in on the issue based on whether they have standing on the topic area and if they meet the requirements to participate. Next is defining what the scope will be. What specifically will the commission decide and what's off the table? Then there's information gathering phases, and this can include workshops, technical meetings, and a lot of written back and forth called discovery or information requests. In formal cases, you're likely to have a hearing where participants can present their evidence to the commission. And then finally, in proceedings, they will typically result in a decision or an order as to what the outcome is. Again, the commission's administrative rules outline how all of this goes down, including an important type of rule called ex parte communications, which defines who can talk to the commissioners and when. And this varies a lot state by state. So who are the participants? Again, the rules will tell you who can participate and what their rights are. In all states, there's a designated entity that's responsible for representing residential customers in proceedings at the PUC, typically known as consumer advocates. I like the image on this slide, which shows that there are a lot of different parties influencing commissioners, whether inside or outside of proceeding. This can be political, industry, advocacy groups, and many others. And I did want to note too, many of you are at state energy offices. It's usually a strategic decision on the state energy office's part as to whether they do participate at the PUC or not. Okay, so delving into the major types of proceedings, the first is rulemaking, and the steps of this are highlighted in the image below. Rulemaking is important because it addresses a policy or legal change that affects how the commission or utility does its business. It typically includes drafting a proposed new rule or changes to the rules, inviting comments from the public and stakeholders, considering and building on those comments and gathering information, and then finalizing and adopting the rules. Depending on your state, the rules might have to go through additional rule by another agency or undergo judicial review as well. General rate cases are foundational proceedings that determine what the utility can charge to their customers, and they are formal or what's called a contested or litigated case, meaning that there are rights at stake in the proceeding. So in a rate case, the commission is determining how much the utility needs to charge to recover their costs. This includes looking at what the utility spends in a year and then determining if those costs are prudent. The year that the utility or that the commission looks at is called a test year, and it can either be based on historical costs or look out into the future, and those approaches both have benefits and drawbacks. In a rate case, the commission will also determine the utility's authorized rate of return, or what the utility is allowed to earn based on its capital structure. And this can be really contentious. It's really often hotly debated by the different parties in the proceeding. Rate cases usually also include an evidentiary hearing, which is like a day in court, where the parties come and they present their case to the hearings officer, which is typically the chair of the commission. And a lot of states have laws governing how rate cases work. So in the image on this slide, you're seeing that Nevada's rate cases have to occur within 210 days. Policy investigations are often much more flexible than rate cases and can use less formal approaches to information gathering, like through stakeholder collaboratives or even seeking public input. These were really my favorite to work on at the commission because they usually address some sort of emerging important policy issue for the utility in the state. This could include equity, smart grid or grid modernization or DER program design. And the outcomes of these proceedings are usually some sort of guidance for a group of utilities on how they should approach things going forward. Another common type of proceeding is called an integrated resource plan. This happens in about 35 states where the utility will create a plan that looks out into the future to see how much electricity they'll need to provide and what the best way is to provide that. Best can, of course, mean different things to different people, and it usually requires balancing many different objectives, like making rates affordable for customers, ensuring reliability, reducing emissions, and reducing risk. In the IRP process, the utility usually first forecasts what it expects demand to be, and then identifies scenarios they need to plan for. Then they model those scenarios and consider what types of resources will best meet the needs based on the resource costs and environmental impacts. And this can include both supply side resources like a solar plant or a gas plant, and also demand side resources like energy efficiency or rooftop solar. At all stages, stakeholders usually weigh in with expertise, advice for how to capture an uncertain future, and then just general comments and questions to help make sure that the utilities plan is useful and robust going forward. Once there's an accepted plan, the utility and commission can use it to help guide their decision making, but plans are usually not definitive and they're meant to be flexible as things change. Another important planning process is called distribution system planning or integrated distribution system planning. And this takes a similar approach to IRP, but specifically looks at the distribution system. And the image here shows elements of a decision-making framework to help regulators and utilities do their IDSP in a way that addresses all these different goals and priorities. As you can see, there's a lot that goes into IDSP, because it really is a foundational element of creating a safe and efficient grid. Depending on your state, there are other types of plans that utilities create as well. So utilities and other entities with a stake in the transmission system will try to answer some of those gnarly questions that we talked about, like where will transmission go? Who will pay for what? And how much transmission do we need? Utilities also plan for electrification and those trends of growing EVs and heating in buildings. If the state has specific goals related to resilience or climate change or DERs, the utility might create a specific plan for those as well. And in general, coordinating all these types of plans in some way helps create efficiencies and makes sure that they are aligned in their objectives and outcomes. Okay, finally, let's talk about who helps regulators make their decisions and how to engage them well for good outcomes. As we talked about, public utility commissions are really facing that changing landscape from many sides. So improving the ways that PUCs engage the entities that work with them has a number of benefits to help them address those new and complex issues. Stakeholder engagement, doing it well, can help make sure that your decisions are more transparent, that your stakeholders are better informed and have more information, and that they collaborate amongst one another. And ultimately, having better information on the record means that commissions will make better decisions. To do this, PUCs can use a variety of approaches. For example, they might intentionally recruit participants that are affected by their decisions. They might use a third-party facilitator to mediate or build consensus. They might use phased approaches where you provide education and then collaborate and then move into a formal decision-making process. Or you might try new approaches as well. The image on the right is a framework that PUCs can use to thoughtfully design their process with stakeholder engagement in mind. It's really important, though, to consider that there are trade-offs to these approaches. So it can take a lot of time to recruit new participants and then ensure that they have what they need to meaningfully participate. So the tactics that you use will vary based on the topic and its scope. In practice, this looks like a shift from our traditional regulatory processes to finding new ways to meet that current need. Traditionally, a proceeding includes communication largely in writing, with back and forth that are shown on the left here of this graphic. And there are good reasons the system was designed this way. Like, it helps to make sure that everyone's legal rights are preserved. and help everybody participate on a level playing field. But it can also create barriers to creativity and consensus building. New stakeholder engagement approaches on the right try to help resolve some of these issues. So this could mean running collaborative meetings and workshops to support learning and cooperation, requiring data sharing, and bringing in outside experts. And then for really innovative or risky ideas, trying them on a smaller scale before you scale them up to a full program. My dog is barking. So in order to do stakeholder engagement well, it's really important to follow some best practices because there are different levels of how much stakeholders can impact your decisions. The image on this slide shows those developmental stages of community engagement specifically, increasing from simply informing the community, then to gathering their input, then to making sure that input is actually integrated into outcomes, then fully collaborating with community on decisions, and finally to even deferring to community's expertise on certain issues. To move along this spectrum, some simple practices really should be in place, like making sure there's ample opportunity at the beginning and then throughout the proceeding for input, making sure everyone knows what's expected of them and what they can expect in return, helping to build capacity so that folks can meaningfully engage, making sure everyone has access to the same and really good information, and then really making sure that there's accountability for how everyone's time and input were valued or used and considered. And then finally, of course, we always want to make sure that we learn from what went well and what didn't and build those learnings into future practices. Okay, that was a lot of information. I want to thank you all for your time this morning. I'm happy to answer your questions and look forward to being a resource for you all going forward as well.
Great. Thanks, Grace. We have about 5 minutes for questions. The questions in the chat box, folks have been answering. So I'm going to ask you one I don't think has been answered yet. Grace, do you see the pathway for new entrants in certain utility service territories changing with all of the new technologies and associated regulations, plus all of the infrastructure needs? So this is about different new pathways for new entrants.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think that a lot of utilities and regulators are trying out new approaches to how they acquire resources. In Hawaii, we have a market or a transaction that we call a grid service purchase agreement. So utilities are actually going out and seeing which companies can offer grid services, the grid services that they need. And it's resulted in some contracts with companies that aggregate really unique DERs like water heaters. And I think that's changing on the national level too. A few years ago, FERC also changed the rules for how DERs can participate in those wholesale markets. And I think in general, folks are trying out new ways of transacting with partners. And I do think it's creating new pathways. I don't know if any of the other of my Berkeley Lab colleagues or others have other perspectives.
No, I think that was a good response. We have a question from Charles Dawson. Charles, feel free to unmute yourself. I'm not sure. Let's see if I need to do that. I will work on it.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is kind of following up on, you mentioned a point where state energy offices make this strategic decision about whether to engage with PUC proceedings. I'm curious if you have for your thoughts on what goes into that strategic decision, like what helps inform states when they're making that decision on whether they want to have that separate state intervention or not.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know Lisa has a lot of experience at a state energy office. So maybe I'll just speak quickly and then see if she has anything to add. There are a lot of things that go into that decision. I think first, of course, there are kind of the logistical things that go into it. Like where am I dedicating my staff time and resources? And then thinking through to what are the strategic priorities for the state energy office right now. So a lot of times the state energy office will be responsive really to what's in its mandate from the state legislature and kind of react to new trends that they're seeing in state policy. And they might decide something that's more technical on the ground that's going on with the utility is maybe not where we need to spend our time right now when there are sort of other higher level picture issues that we need to engage on. But yeah, I don't know, Lisa, if you have anything you want to add too.
Yeah, I have a lot to say on it, but we only have 2 minutes left. I'll put in the chat box a publication that Berkeley Lab wrote with NASEO, the National Association of State Energy Officials. And it was specifically on how state energy offices can engage in distribution system planning, which, you know, is utilities doing the planning. And if it's regulated utilities, it is the Public Utility Commission that really is the decision maker there. And, you know, it's not just about intervening. I think that's the tough choice. And I was surprised at how few state energy offices were intervening in distribution planning when we did our research a year or so ago. And that's increasing. Also, legislatures around the country are actually giving some very critical roles to state energy offices on all kinds of things, including, you know, distribution system planning. So I think we should think of this as not just formal intervention, but all of the ways that state energy offices can be helpful, participating in working groups. In Massachusetts, there's a law that has the state energy office chairing a body that is reviewing the draft grid modernization plans that the regulated electric utilities are filing at the Public Utility Commission. So I think this is really changing, and I'll put the link in the chat for the publication. All right, thanks so much, Grace. And we're going to move next to Pete Cappers, who is going to talk about the sort of basics of cost of service rate making. Pete?
Thank you very much, Lisa. And Grace, amazing job. Welcome to Berkeley Lab. You've been here a couple months. Really excited to have you. Thanks everyone for having me today. I'm really excited to come talk to you about cost of service rate making. As Lisa mentioned, this is really gonna just springboard off of all the information that Grace just provided to you and really give you a lot better understanding, hopefully, about how utility rates are set. So to that end, let me see if I can pull up the actual presentation in slideshow mode. All right, success. Yay, this is not my first rodeo. All right, so let's get started on this. If I can find my notes, that would be helpful. Okay, so yeah, let's just get going. So you just heard from Grace that electric utilities are monopolists. And as such, regulators have to step in to enforce economic efficiency. What that means in practice is they're there to ensure that the price set for electricity is just right in the parlance of the three little bears. And so their job, among other things, is to approve the rates that the electric utility can charge for its services. Now, those rates must be reflective of the costs incurred to serve the utility's customers. The regulator must deem which of those costs have been prudently incurred. The regulator's got to assess which of the utility's assets are considered used and useful in the service of customers and thus warrant recovery from ratepayers. The regulator has to deem whether or not the rates proposed by the utility are fair and reasonable. And lastly, the regulator has to assess whether they will allow the utility a reasonable opportunity to recover its costs and earn a fair rate of return on the capital that's invested. Okay, so utilities, though, they're going to need ample support for their proposed rates that provide a clear and transparent process for identifying the utility's costs of service of serving customers. Such a cost of service, as it's called, well, it usually acts as the basis for the utility's efforts to develop updated rate proposals for regulators to consider. A cost of service study typically includes three core elements. First, it derives the total amount of revenue the utility would be required to collect to fully cover its authorized costs. So this revenue requirement, as it's called, represents the annual cost of serving all of the utility's retail electricity customers. Second, the cost of service study allocates the revenue requirement to each of the utility customers' classes. Now, this represents the level of costs each class imposes on the utility, and thus how much the utility should collect from all members of that class. And third, the cost of service study develops class-specific rate designs that determine how much each customer in the class will be charged for taking electric service from the utility. In effect, this determines the responsibility of each and every customer in that class to cover their fair share of the utility's costs that were allocated to that class. So let's delve a little bit deeper into each element of the cost of service study to really help you better understand how the pieces all fit together. The utilities revenue requirement represents all of the costs incurred by the utility in service to its customers. Well, the largest category of costs comes from the utility's operations and maintenance efforts. Expenses associated with generating electricity, maintaining the distribution system, and even paying the utilities workers. Well, they're all included in this category. The next two categories of expenses relate to utility investments in physical assets. Utilities are allowed to recover all of the costs associated with those investments a regulator has deemed to be used and useful in service to the utility's customers. This allows the utility to include those investment costs in rate base, as it's called, and thus become eligible for recovery from ratepayers. On the one hand, utilities are able to recover the amount of money spent procuring the capital asset. You oftentimes hear this referred to as the return of a utility's capital investment, or as it's more commonly known, its depreciation expense. In simplest terms, depreciation is the equal apportionment of an asset's investment cost over the useful lifetime of that asset. However, more complex approaches can and frequently are taken for a variety of reasons, but that's way beyond our 101 level course. But if you remember your fundamentals of economics class, well, there is a time value of money, and someone's capital is being tied up in that asset, as the utility typically doesn't pay cash for these things. Instead, they pay financiers over the asset's lifetime. So those entities who have lent the utility money must be compensated accordingly. And this is commonly referred to as the return on a utility's capital investments, which goes to both debt holders in the form of interest payments and to shareholders to the degree to which they exist, because not all utilities are actually ones that issue stock. Regulators allow the utility to include the interest payments associated with these rate-based assets to bondholders. But as you just heard from Grace, they authorize the level of return to shareholders that's deemed fair and reasonable. Now, the last category of the revenue requirement captures any state, territorial, or federal income taxes to the degree to which they're even applicable. And as Grace mentioned, there are several different utility models, and some of these taxes may or may not apply depending on which model you're in. Okay, so we have our first poll in this part of the in my presentation. So this question, which type of capital investments are investor-owned utilities able to earn a return on? Only those funded by debt, only distribution and transmission investments, only those funded by equity that are approved by regulators, and only those regulators for inclusion in rate base, and only those approved by regulators for inclusion in rate base. So we've got a couple of different subsets, and a little confusing here, I will admit. Tried to mix this up for everyone, make it a little challenging so it wasn't super obvious. All right. Okay.
We're approaching 50% participation here. We can give it a couple more seconds.
Okay, thanks, Myles.
Yep.
50% participation. I'm glad. Oh, we're up to 60. This is great. I'm actually keeping everyone's attention. I'm glad to hear that. All right, 65%. So yeah, looks like folks are basically, well, not overwhelmingly, but a little over 50% of folks are saying answer D there, only those approved by regulators for inclusion of rate base. You are correct. So let's talk quickly about the other ones, right? So only those funded by debt, like I said, capital investments are funded by debt, but they're also funded by equity in some cases. And so investor-owned utilities typically, actually I should say across the board, they're investor owned. They are issuing equity. And so those, are ones particularly that a utility wants to earn a return on, and those are going to be included in rates. We talked about the fact that if a utility is going to undertake capital investments in all facets of its of the businesses that it or the business activities it undertakes. That's not just distribution and transmission, but generation as well. And even back office business opportunities like customer service systems or things like that. And then the last one, only those funded by equity that are approved by regulators for inclusion in rate base. Well, again, debt and equity is what an investor-owned utility is going to focus on when trying to cover the cost of its investments. But the last part is certainly true. They can only get recovery on assets that regulators have included in what's called rate base. And so again, that's why answer 4 is correct, because it doesn't differentiate by the type of investment, generation, transmission, distribution, or any other type of investment. And it doesn't differentiate by the source of money to cover that investment, debt and equity. It has to just be approved by regulators, which means it gets put into rate base, and therefore you can now recover. All right, thanks. All right, so now what I want to do is I want you to think of the annual revenue requirement as a pie. I'm going to get a little more abstract here to maybe try and help understand better what this concept of revenue requirement, allocation, and the like sort of represent. So think about this pie as representing the utility's annual revenue requirement. That pie is sitting on a table, and it's going to be collected by the utility from all of its customers who are sitting around the table over the course of a year. And they're going to do that in order to provide those customers with safe and reliable electricity service. So this test year revenue requirement, as it's called, it can represent, like Grace said, some historical 12-month contiguous period, or in some cases can actually be some future projected 12-month period. All right, so next up, the cost of service study is going to seek to allocate the revenue requirement to the utility's various customer classes. So the goal here is to ensure that each customer class pays the utility for the costs they cause it to incur when taking electric service. So let's think of this as that class's slice of the revenue requirement pie. So we've got a bunch of residential customers sitting at one corner of the table. How big of a pie slice do they get? If you're my grandmother, you would want the big long nose because God knows you want more fruit than crust, but maybe you're someone who likes crust. The point being, this allocation process ultimately dictates the size of that piece of pie. Now, this is as much as I'm going to go into in my talk, but you're going to get a much more detailed and in-depth description of this allocation process from Ronny Sandoval in a little bit after the break. So now that we've assessed how big the revenue requirement pie is, as well as how big each class's slice of that pie is, the cost of service study is going to conclude by determining how each of those slices are going to be eaten by each of the people in the class. How many bites does each one get? Think of it that way. Now, and what that means is really, how are we going to collect all of that allocated revenue from all the different people in that class? And the effect is a rate design step that allocates that revenue responsibility to each customer in each class. Now, although approved retail rates must fully recover a utility's costs, as we just talked about, and be deemed just and reasonable by regulators, well, there's also a second set of consideration that oftentimes comes into play when designing rates. These rates need to satisfy certain policy or market objectives that can vary based on a state's distinct state or territory. Excuse me, I saw someone from the US Virgin Islands here. State or territory's distinct priorities as represented by their rules, regulations, statutes, and policies, as well as their stakeholders' motivations, to the degree to which they're incorporated into the decision-making process. Now, importantly, these concepts are applied in tandem to determine both the type, design, and amount of each retail rate component. Now, to that end, there is a set of principles that were developed many, many years ago by attributed to James Bondbright, but came out of this book written by 3 different authors, including him, called The Principles of Public Utility Rates. These are oftentimes called Bondbright principles. And they are really oftentimes employed by regulators to ensure that rates are properly designed. Now, These principles include a rate design that's reasonably easy for the average customer to understand and for the utility to implement. It should be it should both ensure the utility sufficiently and fairly collects the appropriate level of revenue from its customers, and in the process avoids inappropriately discriminating against certain customers. Now, while the first two steps in the cost of service study that I previously talked about are rather empirical, this final step oftentimes allows the utility to employ more art than science when designing customer class level rates. For example, suppose a regulator has a policy goal of promoting economic efficiency. The resulting rate could consist of a very complex set of charges that, although they truly reflect the marginal cost of the utility, but only the savviest of customers are really going to be able to understand them. If the rate employed an opt-in enrollment approach, well, then it's likely only a handful of customers would want to take service under something that is so complex, and that's ultimately going to undermine the regulator's intent of more broadly achieving economic efficiency. So the utility might instead decide to design the rate more simply while still attempting to convey, let's say, a more limited subset of information to customers about the marginal cost to serve electricity. The end result would likely be more customers facing it, albeit modestly more efficient, economically efficient rates, than very few customers facing highly economically efficient rates. And so it's a trade-off. So let's delve a little bit deeper into the rate components that comprise a rate. Generally speaking, there are three types of rate components that are most often considered when designing rates. The first is a volumetric energy charge. Now, this is typically a cents per kilowatt hour rate, but it can be designed to differentiate on a number of different levels. First, by how much electricity is consumed. This would be something like a inclining or declining block rate, as it's oftentimes talked about. You can also differentiate by when the electricity is consumed. This is some sort of time-based rate, like a time of use or real-time pricing type rate. Ideally, the cost to produce and deliver a unit of electricity are perfectly recovered by the designed energy charge. However, volumetric energy charges are the bill component most responsive to changes in customer electricity consumption. Thus, there are often policy preferences to make the volumetric energy charge higher to, for example, promote investments in things like energy efficiency. This might explain why there has been a heavy reliance historically on volumetric energy charges to recover a broader array of utility costs than just those that are variable, as it improves the business case for energy efficiency investments. But in contrast, high volumetric energy charges will likely have an adverse impact on EV adoption as they substantially increase the cost of operation due to the cost of charging. Next, there's a volumetric demand charge, which is usually defined as $1 per kW month. The definition of what constitutes a kW month, or the peak demand measurement, has a lot of different elements, including the time period in which it occurs, the duration over which it's measured, and whether it resets every month or is maintained, let's say, for the entirety of a year. A demand charge would ideally be designed by a utility to recover fixed costs driven by infrastructure needs to meet the customer's maximum demand. But in actuality, such rate components are oftentimes not applied at all to some customer classes or used pretty minimally in others. And this is due to the challenges in getting those customers to understand the charges and how those customers can ultimately manage their electricity consumption to mitigate the charge's impact on their monthly bills. In the context of electric vehicles, well, charging represents a real electricity demand intensive activity. And this is especially true for level 2 chargers and certainly true for level 3 DC fast chargers. If a demand charge is applied to a customer who wants to install, let's say, a level 2 or a level 3 charger, well, that could have pretty dramatic adverse impacts on EV adoption because of the increased cost of ownership. The last component I'm going to talk about in this that usually apply to rate and rate design is a customer charge. And this is typically a $1 per month fee associated with simply connecting to the grid and engaging with the utility. In that regard, it would ideally be designed to perfectly collect all customer-related fixed costs associated with things like metering, billing, and account management. However, in actuality, it's often set at a much lower level due to a myriad of reasons, some of which, at least in the residential sector, include equity concerns associated with having a high monthly customer charge, which would be considered regressive for especially lower income customers. So sticking with our examples of rate design applications to EVs, some utilities want to separately meter the electricity needed to meet EV charging demands relative to what's needed to serve the rest of the premise. Now, since that additional meter costs money both to purchase, but also to install, maintain, and operate, the customer charge could be higher for EV rate designs that require a separate meter. Now let's quickly turn to an example to illustrate, put all this together, how we can design a rate component that fully collects the allocated revenue requirement relative to the associated billing demands. So in this case, I want to focus on the non-fuel operations and maintenance costs, which in our little example here totals $85 million during the test year period. Suppose the allocation process assigns 48% of that cost of that 85 million to the residential class and 52% to the commercial class. Now, if the utility wanted to strictly collect these costs through a volumetric energy charge, well, the residential class would pay 17.8 cents per kilowatt hour, while the commercial class would face an 11.9 cents per kilowatt hour charge. Now, these numbers are derived pretty simply by simply dividing the class's allocated revenue requirement by the class's electricity consumption billing determinants, excuse me. Now, in an ideal world, with these cost of service study derived rates approved by regulators, the utility will see costs changing over time at the same level as its billing determinants. The result of which is the utility's collected revenue perfectly matching its incurred cost each quarter or year moving forward, and that's going to generate profits or returns at the authorized levels. But a much more likely scenario is one where costs and revenues change differently over time once the new rates are put into effect. And in that case, the utility's achieved returns may end up being higher or lower than authorized, depending on which element grows faster. This concept of regulatory lag is an inherent feature of cost of service regulation and cost of service rate making. It's actually not a bug. It provides incentives for utility efficiencies and penalizes inefficiencies. So let's look at this in a little more detail. When revenue growth exceeds cost growth between general rate cases, which is the action a utility undertakes with its regulators to reset its rates, as Grace mentioned earlier, the utility's financial picture is going to improve, all things being equal. The utility will experience an increase in annual profits, as shown by the length of the green arrows in the bottom graphic, by keeping rates at their current levels, as shown in the upper graphic. This means a profit-motivated utility has a disincentive to come back in for a general rate case, as the resulting rate decrease will no longer enable the utility to earn these excess returns. However, once the lower rates are put into effect, if nothing else changes, the utility will be right back in the same position of over-earning, although not by as much, even though its customers are seeing lower bills than they otherwise would have due to the lower rates. Alternatively, if cost growth exceeds revenue growth between rate cases, well, then the utility's financial system gets worse, as indicated by the length of the red arrows. To mitigate the financial losses, the utility can undertake a new cost of service study and file for a rate increase with its regulators through a new general rate case. But again, unless the more systemic issues are addressed, this will only solve the problem temporarily. As the graphics illustrate, rates can certainly be reset to align incurred costs to collected revenue based on test year data. But the minute those rates go into effect, with billing determinants growing at a slower pace than cost, the utility is going to continue to see its financial health erode over time. Okay, so by now, hopefully you got a better understanding of how a utility derives the rates it proposes to regulators and the conditions which may motivate it to seek a change in those rates. However, regulators, they don't need to just blindly accept those proposed rates, and in fact, may and do modify them before approving them. You see, regulators have to balance at least three things when determining how to rule on a utility rate filing in a general rate case. First, they're going to look at the utility's financial health and how the requested rate change will affect that health. Cost of service regulation and cost of service rate making generally has regulators focusing on the near-term impacts of the rate change. But it may also be beneficial for regulators to consider, to the degree possible, the longer-term implications of the rate change on the utility's financial situation. Whoops. Second, any rate change will inherently have impacts on ratepayers and the bills they pay for electric service in the short run. But as with the utility, regulators may also want to understand the longer-term impacts of the requested rate change on customer bills in order to determine how to rule on the utility's request. And third, the rate change may have effects on the achievement of various commission or state policy priorities or statutory requirements. Especially in this case, the longer-term impacts on the achievement of these may be positively or negatively impacted by the requested rate change. And thus, regulators may want to understand these impacts in both the short and long run when making their ruling. So we have our last poll question now. Are investor-owned utilities guaranteed to achieve their authorized rate of return, or authorized a return on investment, excuse me? We've got some no, we've got a bunch of no's, we've got a few yeses. True, false, right. Never updated the slide for how Myles wrote the question. My apologies for that, but you see. All right, we're at 80%. Whew, all right, good. So overwhelmingly, the answer is no, and that is true. That is correct. Regulators are authorized to set rates so that utility has the opportunity to recover its authorized rate of return. But as soon as that rate goes into effect, that guarantee is gone. There's a brilliant paper by a colleague of mine, Steve Keim and Eliza Graffi, that talk about this issue specifically. It's really fascinating. They utilize as a metaphor the cable car industry and the streetcar industry in San Francisco, which was a regulated monopoly. Through riders leaving for intra-city buses. The utility came in several years in a row asking for a rate increase because they were losing so much money because they were losing customers. Ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, sorry, this is not, the takings clause from the Constitution does not apply here. You are no longer a monopoly, you are actually in a competitive industry and you are losing that. And so you don't have any right to any guaranteed cost recovery because you're part of a competitive industry now. All right, with that, let's move on to Q&A.
Great, thanks, Pete. That was really a terrific presentation. We had a couple questions in the chat box. I'm going to get to you first, and then if anybody wants to raise their hand, we have until, we have like 8 minutes. So this is a toughie. Is there a standard methodology for ensuring that a utility's costs are reasonable? You can say no, and then we can move on, but you can give a little nuance maybe.
Yeah, they're not. It's definitely subjective as to, what's reasonable, what's prudent, right? I mean, each regulator is going to approach this issue differently. Ultimately, you're looking for, there's a couple different things here, right? If you think about what would be considered an imprudent investment, Vogtle nuclear plant down in Georgia, right? Perfect example of a massive investment with massive cost overruns. And so the question for the regulated, regulator is, do I make ratepayers, do I put them on the hook for these cost overruns, or do I put that on the backs of the utility? Well, if I put it on the backs of the utility, what's going to happen to its financial health? We have someone here from the U.S. Virgin Islands. This is a perfect example of another example of a place where rates are very high. The utilities incurred costs have gotten a little bit out of hand because of some poor decision making historically. And so the commission has not approved costs to go into rates, but that has really undermined the utilities' financial health, and that has adversely then affected reliability. They have rolling blackouts because they have not been able to procure enough diesel fuel to run their diesel generators to have generation meet load, supply meet demand. So, to Lisa's point, there's, it's a balancing act, much like so many other things, in this arena where regulators try and do what's right, try and do what's best in the best interest of ratepayers, because ultimately this is about providing reliable, safe, reliable power at least cost. But there are other considerations that ultimately need to be taken into account.
Great, thanks. And here's another question. This is a really good one. Could an opt-in program with a specific tariff help offset costs that might be associated with, say, EV charging, so that all customers don't have to pay for the service, just the customers who choose to have electric vehicles? This is a great question for you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So sure, you could certainly design a rate that for a subset of customers would produce savings to everyone, right? Like if you can better manage load that is more consistent with cheaper generation, right? That benefits everybody potentially. And so you could think about a utility using that argument to say, okay, I'm going to share some of those savings associated with the potential response that customers make to this rate. I'm going to slightly lower the rate for that class of customers so they get some benefit out of the change in their behavior. But the rest of the customers really get the lion's share of it. So yeah, no, I think that's a perfect example of time of use rates, whether it's for EV charging or just, writ large, that opportunity exists. What we've seen historically is opt-in rates. I mean, we've had TOU rates on the books since PURPA came out in the late 70s. Most utilities have had them since then. What we've oftentimes seen historically is just because you build it doesn't mean they will come, and doesn't mean customers will show up and take these opt-in rates, accept these opt-in rates, move to these opt-in rates, unless they're marketed really, really well. We've seen some examples in the industry where that's the case. Oklahoma Gas and Electric is a wonderful example of a very dynamic time of use rate, where within 3 years, they got 20% of their residential customers to take service on it because of how well they marketed it. Whereas most other TOU rates and these types of offerings are single digits, right? If you move to opt out, we're talking acceptance rates 80 to 90%. And so yes, opt in, you could potentially create some benefits that can be shared, but opt out, the opportunity is there for much greater benefits, and therefore those benefits can be shared across a broader
What about
array of
mandatory time varying rates for EV charging? I mean, we do see that in some places now.
Yeah, so mandatory just says, right, that there's no option. This is the one and only rate you can go on. Certainly that is something that, some utilities are moving in the direction of, to say if this is the end use that you choose to bring to the system and interconnect to the system, we're going to charge you differently because you are imposing very different costs than the average residential customer or the average commercial customer if you're a charging company, right? And so that's the thing to remember in terms of cost of service rate making, is it's about cost causation, how you define cost causation, and therefore how do you define different customer classes or different subsets of customers within a class? Because that ultimately determines allocation. Again, Ronny Sandoval coming up next. I'm going to talk all about that. And therefore the money you got to collect from that class, and then how you design rates to do that.
Right. With about 2 minutes, somewhat complicated question. I'm going to restate it a little bit. You clarified in the poll question, investor-owned utilities are not guaranteed to achieve their authorized rate of return. You set rates with the goal that they will achieve their rate of return. As soon as the rate is in effect, what happens, with quantity, of electricity. So the question relates to how can regulators encourage utilities to adopt new technologies such as distributed energy resources? And I think you need to answer that question with respect to utility-owned. Say utility owned or utility scale storage.
Yep.
And customer owned. Because
Yep.
and when does again, utility gets an opportunity to return on something that the commission has authorized in its rate base? That is usually a capital investment. It can be other expenditures like energy efficiency, or who knows, even storage. So maybe try to answer that. I'll give you a couple minutes.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, as a so yeah, think of this. I like the way Lisa has framed this as utility ownership versus customer ownership, because as Lisa mentioned, this thing she's talking about of this preference, if you're an investor-owned utility and your profit is tied to how big your rate base is, and rate base is tied to how many investments you've made, the total size of investments you've made. Utilities have a strong preference, incentive to invest in more things than less. It's called the Averitt-Johnson effect. And so what you see is regulators, looking to say, okay, since we know that's the incentive, in some cases that's fine, that's perfectly okay, and we want the utility to invest in these things because nobody else can do it. Or in certain instances, we think this is an infant industry. That's an argument oftentimes given for why maybe let's let the utility do this initially. EV infrastructure is a perfect example of this, where certain places the competitive EV market is not going to make investments in charging infrastructure. And so the argument that has been made to allow utilities to get a rate of return on EV charging investment is to say, we're going to let you do this in places that are likely going to be underserved because you're sort of the provider of last resort, or this is an infant industry and the market is not moving yet. And so we're going to allow you to be that market mover. But at some point, we don't want you to do that anymore. We want the broader competitive industry to really take over and not have this, not allow the monopolist to have a competitive advantage. So that's one thing. The alternative way of thinking about this is by doing it from a process standpoint. Lisa knows this better than anybody in terms of planning and non-wires alternative. So how do you create a process that disincentivizes the utility from always choosing capital investment versus looking at what we call non-wires alternatives? So looking at customer resources or other non-wires, infrastructure investments on the utilities, on the part of the utility, to solve whatever this planning issue is. So there's many different ways. Those are sort of, I would say, the two main ways you do it, and then within each one, there's lots of different ways in which regulators can incentivize, either one to work.
Great, thanks so much, Pete. We'll leave it there. We're going to take a break until a quarter till, and then we're going to come back with Ronny Sandoval diving into some of the cost allocation questions that people have been asking. So thanks again, Pete, and we'll be back at a quarter till. Thank you. Okay, hopefully you all had a quick break, and we can proceed to our next presenter. Ronny Sandoval from the Regulatory Assistance Project is going to do a deeper dive into a topic that Pete Cappers just touched on, cost allocation. Ronny?
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me? That's quick.
Yes.
Awesome, thank you very much. Let me just pull up my slide and share. Okay, let's see. Am I sharing now?
Yes, I don't know if you
I-
can get it into a presentation mode.
Yep, we'll do that in a second. Okay, great.
Perfect.
Should see my title slide. Well, thank you very much. So again, my name is Ronny Sandoval. I'm with an organization called the Regulatory Assistance Project, which focuses on providing technical assistance to a number of state commissions and other decision makers on topics around the emerging energy transition. And really appreciate the opportunity to present to you on this topic of cost allocation, which is something RAP has focused on historically for many, many years. And I actually think this is a very important area. Coming as an engineer, this is something that, the topic of cost allocation, you can have sort of the best proposal, best ideas, best projects in the world, but if you can't agree with key stakeholders, customers, other decision makers on how those costs associated with that project should be apportioned, who bears what portion of those costs, even the most beneficial projects would have a very challenging time moving forward. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this topic. Just as a brief overview, I would start with a discussion on why we think cost allocation matters, followed by some level setting and key concepts. We hope to then discuss a few uses of the results of the cost of service study, preview or go through a few of the challenges associated with allocating demand and energy to the various customer classes, and end with a few alternative best practices for the allocation of costs related to some of the projects that we'll discuss today. I don't know if you have, there it is. Great. So I did want to start with this poll question. Again, didn't want to make it too easy, so the answers are very close, but wanted to get a sense from you all what you think the average cost of residential energy is for customers in the US. I'll give you a few moments to think about that. Looks like everyone's ready to participate, 72% already. Anyway, can we call it?
I have called it. Can we
Okay,
see
great.
the results?
I do see the results. So I think we do have, it is a minority of the folks that got it right. So the answer really is 14 cents per kilowatt hour. Hopefully you can see the slide that I've pulled up here. Even though the average is 14 cents per kilowatt hour, as you can see that across the country, there's a wide range of what those residential customer costs are per kilowatt hour. And one of the things I wanted to convey here is that though there are a number of factors that impact residential rates, including some of the actual, physical costs of the energy system, and essentially, the decisions that led to those investments. There are a number, essentially the balance of the cost associated with operating the system are met by the remaining classes, including commercial, industrial, municipal, and the like. So even though a portion of these costs are met by residential customers, other customers have to bear the balance of the costs in order to meet the revenue requirements that we discussed a little bit earlier. So jumping right in, why does cost allocation matter? So I think, as a collective, as we heard earlier, electric customers are responsible for meeting the utility revenue requirement of approved projects. The portion of the costs that are not borne or covered by certain customer classes necessarily have to be met by the remaining customer classes. So there's essentially a balance that takes place there. And in order to ensure equity across the customer classes, it's important to assign the allocation or allocate those costs based on a couple of key analytical concepts that we discuss here. So one way of doing it is cost causation, which is essentially tries to determine which customer or customer segments essentially drove the investments or drove the cost that is now reflected or that is considered to be reflected in rates. The other potential approach involves essentially assigning costs based on who benefits. So in this scenario, irrespective of who triggered the cost, one could potentially charge customers or allocate costs based on who makes the best, who's making the most use of that asset. So irrespective of who triggered it, who on an ongoing basis is actually benefiting from the investments that were made. And in essence, the data and analysis from the cost allocation process is then used to determine what rates are offered or proposed to the different customer classes. So this is another graphic or another view of a concept that Pete walked through earlier today. Essentially, the revenue requirement includes some of those cost components that we discussed earlier, including the operations, taxes, rate of return, and those elements. And eventually, in the section at the bottom, what you see is proposed options for how different customer classes would be billed for costs associated with the system. I think we will focus primarily on the section in the middle that focuses on the allocations across the residential, commercial, industrial classes listed here. So just a deeper view into what this entails. So there are a number of functional elements in the electric system that are reflected here in terms of generation, transmission, distribution, billing, and customer service that essentially from that revenue requirement, you break up the types of cost into these functional elements. Based on those elements, traditionally and historically what most commissions and utilities have done is assign those functional costs to a number of different classifications, what's called here, which involves whether something is demand related, essentially our costs driven by uses or investments that happen to serve peak demand. There's energy related, which essentially involves costs that operate across most hours of the year. And then there are customer related costs that involve things like meters, involves dedicated service lines, things that vary with the number of customers that you have on the system and not necessarily with the amount of energy that you use. Based on that classification, those costs have been further allocated to a number of different customer segments, including residential, commercial, industrial, and lighting. The reason why these costs are allocated across these customer groups, essentially, the utilities commissions try to group the costs based on the types of profiles that one can assign certain costs to. So residential customers, for instance, in aggregate, consume most of their energy late afternoon hours, in the evening hours, and there's a rationale for grouping those costs together because if that's when they use their energy, that's when distribution assets have to be deployed. That's when certain supply costs are incurred. And it makes sense to group customers just based on the types of costs that they trigger and how they use their energy. Commercial primarily are daytime peaking. They use their they have the most alignment with system peak times, in which essentially the system uses the most energy, and again have a different profile than residential customer. Industrial customers may have things like heavy machinery, may have different demand needs than commercial and residential customers, and it makes sense to group them in a separate category just based on their needs, including potentially not needing as much of the distribution system because they may be served at higher voltages. And lastly, street lighting may sound a little random to just bring up here compared to some of these uses, but street lighting, as you might imagine, primarily should only operate during evening hours and may have a city or a town be the primary customer. So there's a consolidation of billing and accounting that happens across those classes. And just a flashback to 1992, this is a manual that NEAR put together that essentially reflects these sort of class functions and classifications. Again, you see the traditional use of demand and energy breakout, and customer costs, again indicating things like billing and dedicated service lines that may be best apportioned to specific customers that are making use of those assets. So in terms of don't see an image here, determining the customer classes, you can, even though I described 4 main categories, you can further break those down into subcategories that could include things like religious institutions that are operating on weekends. You can have customers that have distributed energy resources that have a different usage profile than a traditional residential customer who may not have that. These sorts of distinctions may merit the creation of additional classes in order to ensure that costs are allocated in the most equitable way possible across the customer segments, and also to provide a meaningful signal for customers to take certain actions that potentially may reduce system costs. Again, I highlighted an example earlier of let's say an industrial customer that may be served by higher voltage, maybe a primary customer that may be served at a higher voltage of 13 kV or 4 kV. For that kind of customer, it may not be equitable to apportion costs associated with secondary customers that are downstream from that, including secondary transformer, secondary network costs that that primary customer or industrial customer may not necessarily benefit from. In terms of just some concepts around cost causation on the electric system, the intent, the system as a whole is aimed at solving the energy or meeting the energy needs of all customers across all hours. But each function, like generation, transmission, distribution, all have different factors that contribute to their cost drivers. So again, you may have peak supply rates that impact certain customer decisions when it comes to conservation, maybe when they decide to use certain equipment. There could be transmission infrastructure that could be used to serve an entire network, or potentially just serve a small group of customers. There could also be distribution system costs that may serve only a single customer down a very long line. and may not necessarily be something that may be equitable to share those costs across a broader segment. So these are decisions that are not necessarily written in stone. I think Pete indicated that there was a bit of an art and a science to how the costs are essentially from a range of options, how costs are allocated across different customers, and regulators have a discretion on essentially a range of options that could still result in a reasonable allocation and still be within that general range of potential options. And in addition to some of the costs that one may arrive at after the cost of service studies, there may be additional system benefits, societal goals, things like affordability, additional equity components that one may want to build into rate design in order to provide a signal or provide relief to certain customer classes that may be of interest. I'll gloss over this a little bit, but in essence, there is all costs associated with the build out of certain assets. If you look in a narrow time frame, in a narrow enough time frame, you can consider those costs as being more fixed or short run because they don't necessarily vary within that short horizon. But as one grows, one operates the system, you could have costs like wear and tear. You can have costs like the use of certain assets that essentially change the long run operational cost of that asset, and it may make sense to revisit over time what those costs ultimately become in order to and who contributes to those costs varying in order to revisit how those costs should be allocated. And in terms of just putting a finer point on that distinction, peaker plants may have a mix of fixed and variable costs when it comes to their operations. So you have the physical build out of the asset, and over time, fuel costs and other operational costs, those are variable, and over time, those can be accounted for. Battery storage, given the fact that there's really no fuel costs associated with it, you primarily have the cost of the assets being driving those costs, and those are primarily fixed. But you can have things like wear and tear that contribute to some variability. And then demand response, because you're asking customers to take action, those costs tend to be more variable based on how frequently you call that resource, when you call that resource, and those costs do tend to vary and are not as predictable. So in terms of, again, using the results of the cost allocation studies, you typically, again, it's a blend of an art and a science, and you typically have a range of reasonable approaches that one can pursue in allocating costs to certain customers. So again, you can have things like wanting to address affordability for certain customer segments. If you're a state that wants to, let's say, attract manufacturing or economic development, you may take a look at things like the large commercial rate and see if that is an opportunity to revisit the allocation and the types of rate structures that are provided to customers to make it attractive to relocate. So there's a range of there's discretion that decision makers can employ in settling on a cost allocation structure. These cost allocation primarily is concerned with equity across those customer classes, including residential, the commercial, large industrial, street lighting, and the like. and ensuring that costs are equitably allocated to those classes. When you get into rate design, you can then start to explore ways in which you might design the rates or the mix of rate components in a way that sends a signal for customers to conserve, especially if you have, again, time varying rates where you want to encourage conservation during certain times of the day to provide system benefits, or exploring new ways to account for demand charge reform. So I think we talked about some of the historical ways in which cost of service studies have been employed, but with the advent of advanced metering, ways in which greater recognition of customer capability to respond to price signals and reforms in rate design, one can essentially shift from that traditional paradigm in which the functionalized costs that we listed here are better allocated across a more time variant approach in the allocation and the assignment of cost across the categories. So this, again, in this segment here, you have that move from the demand-related, energy-related, customer-related sort of regime and moving into a more reflective, time-reflective cost allocation that can be assigned to the different customer classes. And you can see in this sort of side-by-side how those two potential approaches have evolved. In my state, I'm based in Colorado. We have moved from, even for residential customers, have moved towards a more time varying approach in which there are certain hours of the day I know not to use certain equipment because I know that my rates are going to be higher, but and there's equipment to actually measure my response and ensure that I'm also benefiting from taking action in helping to support the system and also contributing to the management of energy costs.
Ronny, just a time check. You have about 5 minutes for presentation.
Yep, almost done. So again, you can, with this additional view of the time breakdown where you have a more time variant component, you can take those functional elements like generation, like transmission and distribution, to break it down into these sort of peak, intermediate, and all hours components. And by breaking it down into those functional elements or the sub-functional elements, you can then sort of layer and stack those identified and allocated costs to the hours of the day in which those costs are incurred, and then develop a rate design or develop a way of communicating those costs to customers so that you can drive action and just inform customers about when their actions are driving costs for the system. The traditional way of doing this, there's been, because we didn't have the telemetry, we didn't have the data collection, it became hard to, in essence, account for or overlay when individual customers were peaking, when the customer class as a whole was peaking, and when system peaks were being when those costs aligned with the system peak in a way that allowed for customers to react and take action. But again, when you're able to provide that time signal, collect the data, you're better able to align those costs in a way that's reflective of what's driving this cost and what customers are able to do about it. And lastly, I'll end here with this slides on best practices. So for all sort of approaches, whether it's the historical or maybe this new approach of using a more time variant approach, one can apportion the costs associated with shared assets to the customers that are actually benefiting from that. Costs that are more customer specific to a dedicated customer class, those should be apportioned to that class or those customers. Administrative general costs that benefit most customers, should be shared across the entire customer segment. And if one can avoid, if one has the ability to assign costs in a more granular and time reflective manner, one should pursue those in order to, again, provide that signal to customers to take action, and also better understand the appropriate allocation across customer segments. So again, if you're able to make clear who's driving those costs, share that information with planners to allocate those costs, and then also send a price signal, you can have a more efficient system than I think we've had in the past. Lastly, a lot of this information is found in the electric cost allocation manual, which includes, we developed, I think, almost about a decade ago now. We need to update it, but there's a discussion of historically what has been, and some discussion of potential, future approaches to better allocate cost across the various customer segments. But with that, I'll pause there. Hopefully I'm right on time, and open it up for questions.
Great, thanks so much, Ronny. We don't have any questions in the chat. Does anybody want to raise their hand with a question? We have, about 2 minutes. And I always have questions. I don't know if you could think about a key takeaway or two that you're really hoping. This is a pretty deep subject, right?
Right.
It's a really important one. Like you said, this is all about equity between customer classes, and we're getting new customer classes like EV charging. We just talked about in this session. Are there like a couple of key messages that you hope that the fellows take away today from your presentation?
Yeah, happy to express a couple of those. So again, the focus here is on ensuring that customers, stakeholders are walk away with a understanding that the allocation of costs associated with the investments that are made after commission determine that they are prudent and that cost recovery is allowed, to create that level of comfort that the allocation is fair, and ultimately the rate design that follows is also well informed and developed with a solid foundation. When you get into new uses like electrification, like distributed energy resources, things that historically have not been as explored as traditional investments in T&D and generation, there's a lot of room for sort of a back and forth or dissension when it comes to agreeing on the types of costs that are prudent and that should be borne by certain customers. I think we talked about transmission earlier. Transmission, especially across various states or number of utilities, that where that transmission could expand. If certain customers or certain decision makers don't feel that they're getting the benefit that are essentially driving the investment in certain certain assets, you could end up with folks saying no to things that are beneficial and are in the best interest. So better collection of data, better alignment in terms of standardization on how to consider the benefits, and developing a cost allocation approach that works could give folks the comfort that they can move forward with certain investments with confidence. So I think this serves as a great foundation for not just the rate designs, but moving forward with investments that make sense for various states and utilities.
Great, thanks so much, Ronny. Appreciate your presentation. Our last presentation for today's training is Myles Collins. Myles recently joined us from Burbank, city of Burbank, where he was a rates manager and has a long history of working with public and private utilities on demand response, resilience, all kinds of topics, and is an expert in the area of benefit cost analysis, which I think you'll find you'll be using or at least hearing about in probably most of your fellowships. Myles?
Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Myles Collins. I'm happy to be here today speaking with you about the topic of cost effectiveness evaluation. So my background is in policy analysis. I've worked in various sectors of the utility industry, including at Southern California Edison, doing strategy, planning, and analytics for customer programs. I've also worked in the consulting industry evaluating DR programs, conducting value of reliability and resilience studies, and performing benefit cost analyses for grid resilience investments. So benefit cost analysis is something that is near and dear to my heart. So to start off, utilities face a number of different objectives that they balance when making decisions. You'll often hear utility leaders talk about their key pillars of safety, reliability, affordability, and sustainability. The graphic with the circles all the way on the right here shows a few other objectives: resilience and equity. And in addition, there are often state policies and regulatory mandates that they need to consider as well, such as building and transportation electrification. Over the years, utilities and regulators have developed and honed a set of decision-making methods to approach the question of whether or not to make an investment or which alternative to choose amongst a set. Cost effectiveness evaluation is one key tool in the toolbox of utilities and regulators. It assesses the benefits and costs of alternative courses of action and is used to show that the selected path is reasonable and merits cost recovery. There are two key approaches for cost effectiveness evaluation, which are illustrated by the blue boxes here in the diagram. The first is benefit cost analysis, or BCA. When we use BCA, we're attempting to represent all the costs and benefits of a past or future decision in dollars. And I'll get more into detail on this, but it's this consistency which makes comparison between costs and benefits straightforward, with decision makers able to determine whether the benefits outweigh the costs and by how much. The second approach is least cost, best fit, also called lowest reasonable cost analysis. With this method, the need for a project has already been established. So it's not about determining whether benefits outweigh costs, but about finding the option that's a good fit and which will have as low of an impact as possible on the revenue requirement. We'll also touch on other tools, two other tools for addressing decisions with multiple objectives: multi-criteria decision analysis and value spend efficiency, and how cost effectiveness can be an input into those methods. All right, and this takes us to our first poll question, which I am opening now. So this is actually a bit of trivia here. So, which US president first mandated benefit cost analysis for federal regulatory impact analysis by signing an executive order that stated, regulatory action shall not be undertaken unless the potential benefits to society from the regulation outweigh the potential costs to society? Was it Ronald Reagan in 1981, Richard Nixon in 1972, Bill Clinton in 1993, or George W. Bush in 2001?
And
This is a toughie.
I will
Yes.
acknowledge here that I got this question wrong in our trial run.
Yeah, it's not an easy one. This is a bit of learning trivia here. All right, we're at 2/3 participated, 70%. I'm going to give a couple more seconds. Let's see if we can get 75%. All right, I'm going to end the poll, share the results. I just want to congratulate the group. the most popular answer was the correct answer, is Ronald Reagan in 1981. So it looks like close to 40% of the people got that. When this was signed, opponents complained, quote, that the rule requires assigning dollar values to things that are essentially not quantifiable. Human life and health, the beauty of a forest, the clarity of the air at the rim of the Grand Canyon. So if we fast forward 40 years and we'll see that some of the coolest aspects of benefit cost analysis are that we figured out methods for quantifying these things and assigning dollar values. The benefit cost analysis is what we'll start out with here, and it can be used for all types of investments or policy decisions, both within and outside of the utility context. Regardless of the industry or the decision, it follows a series of steps that have been well established in regulatory proceedings, peer-reviewed literature, and textbooks. Now, the steps you see may vary slightly depending on the source, but they all generally follow the approach in this diagram. And we'll go through each step in the subsequent slides, but just to give an overview. First, we set the framework of the analysis by specifying a set of alternatives to analyze and determining which costs and benefits to consider and for how long. Next, we undertake the analysis. We determine the impacts of each alternative and convert those impacts into dollars stretching out into future years. Next, we convert future year dollars into present year dollars, such that we can have an apples-to-apples comparison between costs and benefits. Next, we perform a sensitivity analysis. We consider any other factors which could influence our decision-making, and we make a recommendation. The first step in the process, then, is to specify a set of alternative investments or courses of action to analyze. One of the alternatives should be the business as usual or status quo option. Now, this represents what course of action we would take in the absence of following any of the alternatives. All costs and benefits in the analysis are measured in relation to the status quo alternative. If there's no status quo option, then projects can be evaluated against each other. What follows from the set of alternatives is the time frame for the analysis. So if we're comparing alternatives with expected useful lives of 5 years, then we'd likely look that far out into the future. If the projects had, let's say, a 20 to 30-year lifespan, then the time frame would be longer. Common applications of benefit cost analysis are distributed energy resource programs and procurements, such as energy efficiency and demand response. And other applications are grid modernization investments and resilience plans. In each of these types of applications, we're determining whether to make a relatively large investment up front in order to realize smaller streams of annual benefits into the future. The next step in the benefit cost analysis process is to determine which costs and benefits to include. This depends on the perspective of the analysis. So this slide shows the 5 principal cost effectiveness tests for demand-side management programs. Some of these tests are also used by certain states for grid investments as well. Now, this table illustrates the different perspectives a benefit cost analysis can take. It lists the formal name of the cost effectiveness test, the perspective it represents, and the question that the analysis is attempting to answer. So starting at the top with the societal cost test, this is the perspective that includes the utility system and society as a whole. So the utility system includes all elements of the electricity system that are necessary to deliver services to the utility's customers. The elements that would be outside of the utility system, but including in the societal cost test, would be things like benefits from reduced greenhouse gas emissions, where society in general benefits from it, but there aren't any direct benefits to the utility system. The total resource cost test is the next test that's listed. And this is used in California to determine if demand-side resources are cost-effective compared to other types of procurements. The utility cost test or program administrator cost test takes the perspective of the utility system, answers the question of will utility costs decrease. The participant cost test for a demand-side management program, let's say, it takes the perspective of program participants. We're looking at the question of will the program participants' costs decrease? And this could be an indicator of what kind of levels of participation you might get in the program. And then finally, there's the ratepayer impact measure. This takes the perspective of rates, and really it looks at whether utility rates will increase or decrease from the investment or the program. There's cases where benefits in one test are costs in another. So for example, program incentives where you're incentivizing customers to purchase energy efficient appliances would be a benefit to the participant, but would be a cost for ratepayers or in the rate impact measure. So it's important to determine which perspective you're going to take. And it's common to perform a benefit cost analysis from multiple perspectives. But in any case, you want to determine that in advance of doing the analysis. Once we have our set of alternatives and we know which costs and benefits to consider, we assess the impacts of each alternative. And to do so, we select measurement indicators to represent these impacts. An important requirement for using an indicator is that we're looking for a cause and effect relationship between the investment and the indicator. So in other words, the impact must be a result of the project. The indicators are not yet monetized at this point in the analysis, but they're defined quantitatively for each alternative. Now, this slide shows examples for two illustrative applications, a demand-side management program and a grid investment. The examples are for two different perspectives as well. We'll look at the utility system perspective and the societal perspective. You'll see that many benefits in benefit cost analyses are actually avoided costs relative to the status quo. So under the status quo, we may incur costs every year, but with the investment we're analyzing, we can avoid those costs in future years. For a demand-side management program like energy efficiency, if we're looking from the utility system perspective, the utility may be able to avoid procuring or generating energy, which is measured in megawatt hours. To the extent that peak loads are reduced, it may also avoid the need to build additional transmission or distribution capacity. This is measured in megawatts. Moving to the right, a benefit that would not impact the utility system, as I had mentioned, but which would impact society as a whole, would be avoided greenhouse gas emissions. These are measured in tons of CO2 equivalent. For the second illustrative example, let's say we have a grid investment that improves reliability or resilience and results in fewer or shorter outages. From the utility system perspective, examples of benefits or avoided costs would be avoided truck rolls to restore power and avoided calls to the call center to report outages. Societal benefits would be the avoided outages that customers experience and the related costs that they incur. We'll use here the measurement indicator of avoided outage minutes. And let's assume for this example, there's safety benefits as well. And we'll include here the measure of avoided fatalities as a benefit. After determining the impacts of each alternative, we monetize the impacts for each year throughout the project lifespan. So monetizing costs is relatively straightforward. Monetizing benefits is more complicated. Utility costs are reflected, utility costs, so if we're looking at avoided utility costs, these are generally reflected in budgets and in the cost of service studies, which Ronny and Pete just outlined. These types of avoided costs can be estimated using that data that utilities have related to their underlying cost structure. Certain types of avoided costs, mainly those that apply to the societal perspective, cannot be easily estimated by checking market data or budgets. And this is where I think benefit cost analysis gets really interesting. Now, researchers over the last several decades have been advancing what are known as non-market valuation methods, which can measure the benefits of goods and services that are not bought and sold directly. And so we can't observe their prices. There's two types of non-market valuation methods. In stated preference studies, researchers will use surveys to elicit a person's willingness to pay for certain goods and services. The questions are hypothetical, but researchers have been honing these types of methods to understand bias and to reduce bias that these surveys may have based on their framing. So there's on the slide a picture of the Exxon Valdez, because after the tanker crashed in Prince William Sound in March of 1989, there was talk of a settlement between Exxon and the state of Alaska for the damages from the oil spill. There was a study conducted on the economic losses of reduced recreation in the area, which came out to about $4 million. But that didn't capture the value that the sound had just from its existence in a pristine state. The state of Alaska funded a stated preference study, which estimated the American public's willingness to pay to avoid a similar spill. This amount came out to $3 billion, and this ended up being the basis for the settlement between Alaska and Exxon. Now, this study really propelled forward the use of stated preference studies, and now we use them for applications such as measuring costs that residential customers incur from experiencing power outages. In revealed preference studies, let's use safety as an example. Researchers can infer the value of safety from market decisions that people make in which safety is one factor in their decisions. So they can look at employment decisions and they can determine how much of a wage increase it would take to accept incremental increases in risk. This slide shows the impacts from the previous slide, with some added yellow text indicating how we might monetize those impacts. So for demand-side management, the utility system, avoided energy generation, the values that a utility uses are generally predetermined based on an agreement between regulators and the utility, but avoided energy generation can be represented by market prices or by marginal cost of generation. For avoided transmission distribution capacity, you can use calculated savings from estimates of deferring or avoiding future upgrades. Moving right, if we're looking at the avoided greenhouse gas emissions, some portion of the cost of greenhouse gases may be built into the cost of energy already, depending on the state and whether they have a mechanism in place like cap and trade. Other jurisdictions, that might not be the case. And in some jurisdictions, there may be a portion of the cost built in to energy prices, and maybe there's an additional adder to reflect additional benefit, the additional societal benefit from avoided damages. So EPA in this case provides a social cost of greenhouse gases value, which estimates the avoided societal costs from reducing greenhouse gas emissions in a particular year. So for the grid investment that improves reliability or resilience, we can look, as I mentioned, at utility cost structure and determine how much each truck roll costs on average based on time and resources that it takes. And we can estimate an avoided cost of this. And we can do the same thing for calls to the customer call center. If we're looking at the societal perspective costs, or the societal perspective avoided costs, for avoided outage minutes, we would look at customer interruption costs. So Berkeley Lab is a tool that aggregates customer interruption cost studies and provides estimates of avoided customer interruption costs for improvements in reliability. So given a project that might improve reliability for a certain set of customers, what are the interruption costs that we would be avoiding based on the reduction in customer outage minutes into the future? For avoided fatalities, the U.S. Department of Transportation publishes guidance each year on what's called the value of a statistical life. And this is estimated from the revealed preference studies that I had mentioned on the previous slide. So every year they update this value of a statistical life. 2023, that value was $13.2 million. Once we've monetized our future stream of benefits, we begin the process of converting those dollars to consistent present value dollars by discounting future benefits. And there's generally two factors to consider when we're discounting. The first is to convert dollar figures from nominal to real to account for inflation. The concept of inflation is something that we're all generally familiar with. So a dollar 40 years ago had more purchasing power than a dollar does today. We want to express all dollars in terms of a base year. So in the graph here on the slide, we see the impact of inflation using a base year of 1999. So a dollar in 1999 has about the same purchasing power as $1.80 does today. So we're aiming to express our dollars in real terms, and we're pegging it to a base year. Once we have dollars in real terms, then we apply our discount rate. The discount rate reflects how we value benefits in the future versus benefits today. The higher the discount rate, the lower the value we place on future benefits. So if we had a discount rate of 0, then we would value today's benefits equally with those in the future, no matter how many years they were out into the future. Choosing the discount rate is a policy decision because it reflects the time preferences that we will apply in the analysis. The table at the bottom of this slide shows typical discount rates. So for an investor-owned utility and a publicly owned utility, the discount rate reflects the costs of accessing capital to fund the investment. For an IOU, this is the weighted average cost of capital, or WACC, and represents its blended cost of capital across debt and equity. For POUs, the cost of borrowing is just tied to debt. The low risk and societal discount rates are lower. The societal rate reflects the idea of intergenerational equity, where we would try to ensure that we are placing the appropriate value on the benefits that future generations would realize from such things as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In some jurisdictions, guidance is to use the societal discount rate with a societal cost test in either the weighted average cost of capital or cost of borrowing for making decisions about the utility system. Next, we get to calculating net present value. So this spreadsheet is an illustrative example of how we would go about that process. If we look at the blue area on the top of the table, this gets our discount rate and our discount factor. So let's say we had a real discount rate of 6%. The discount factor in that second line reflects how much we would be multiplying our real dollars by, what fraction of those real dollars we would realize as part of present value dollars. So this is the process of converting all the future year dollars to present value dollars. In year 0, which is our base year, there is no discounting. We would multiply that by 1. The farther we move out into the future, that we're taking 6%, 6%, 6% less, such that by the time we get out to year 5, the present value of $1 is just 75 cents. The yellow portion here represents the costs. So total costs in year 0, let's say we have a $1 million capital expenditure, followed by a series of $10,000 costs for operating and maintaining whatever investment that we made. So we can see the total costs are in real dollars. The discounted costs are for year 1, $1 million, and then we see the decrease moving on to year 5. The present value of costs is just the sum of the discounted costs, or just over $1 million. And the same is true, it's a similar process with benefits. So we have 3 illustrative avoided costs. These are value streams that we get from the investment starting the year after the investment is made. They're summed in the line that says total avoided costs, and then they're discounted by multiplying that total avoided costs by the discount factor, and we add them all together to get the present value of the benefits, which is $1.15 million. So the net present value, and this is a key metric for benefit cost analysis, is $110,943. And that represents the difference between the present value of the benefits and the present value of the costs. The other key metric for a benefit cost analysis is what's called the benefit cost ratio. So with the benefit cost ratio, we're just dividing the present value of the benefits by the present value of the costs. So important thresholds here: if the net present value is over 0, then the benefits outweigh the costs. If the benefit cost ratio is greater than 1, again, the benefits outweigh the costs. So this brings us to our second poll, which I will launch now. So another trivia question, but this helps with getting our heads around some back of the envelope methods for understanding discounting. So the question is, the rule of what number is a shortcut we can use for calculating the number of years it would take to have the discount factor. So the formula is this number divided by discount rate equals the years to get to a discount factor of 0.5. I'll give everyone a few seconds here.
And Myles, while we're giving people a chance to answer, why is this important? How is this used?
This is good for building intuition about the impact of discounting on future benefits. You can also use, this is a version of this rule that investors use for determining how long it would take their money to double with a fixed rate of return. So if you see a discount rate and you're trying to think about how this might impact future benefits, this is just a simple back of the envelope calculation you can use in your mind without having to open up a spreadsheet like the one that I just had on the last slide. Okay, I am going to end the poll and share the results. And I'm going to say, again, very impressed with this group. You got the first trivia question right. This trivia question also got right. So it's the rule of 72. So the way we use this is that if we see that we're going to be discounting by 7%, by the rule of 72, we would say, all right, 72 divided by 7%, it's about 10. So in about 10 years, our benefits would be worth half as much in present value terms as they are today. Okay, we have our results. We have our net present value. We have our benefit cost ratio. Now it's time to perform a sensitivity analysis. So we want to understand how sensitive our results are to the assumptions that we used. So we adjust the analysis inputs by small amounts, and we see how that changes the results. One thing, for example, that we can check is the discount rate. How would the results change if the discount rate was higher or lower? If there's other sources of uncertainty in the analysis, we could change those by small amounts as well in order to see how that changes the end result. One thing that you'll likely see out there is something called Monte Carlo simulation. Monte Carlo simulation is a useful tool for exploring the uncertainty behind an analysis as well. So practitioners can use it when the possible values of uncertainties are represented by distributions, and when there is a mathematical model that can be used to calculate results. So in a Monte Carlo simulation, you take values from the distributions based on their probability of occurrence, you put them into the mathematical model, and the model spits out what the result is. You can aggregate this over thousands of model runs, and you get a sense of the impact that your uncertainty has on your results. We typically see these with integrated resources planning, where we could be looking at different scenarios that are defined by different values for uncertainties. So we have our net present value, we have our benefit cost ratio, we have some idea of the sensitivity of the results. And now, before making a recommendation, we want to assess any other factors which could be important to stakeholders, but may not be reflected in the results. Examples of this could be distributional impacts. So we would want to understand if certain customers are bearing more of the costs and others might be realizing more of the benefits. Or another example would be if vulnerable or disadvantaged communities are benefiting from the decision or the investment. The impact of uncertainty. So are results robust to the broken assumptions? If the assumptions fail or they're not exactly what we think are going to happen, would our chosen investment perform really poorly? Perhaps there may be considerations to be made for an investment that was more robust across multiple potential futures instead of just picking the highest one. But in essence, we want to understand the impact of uncertainty on the results. And then other potential benefits that we just couldn't monetize in the analysis, which we might figure would play some impact in the decision making. So these could be job creation or an improved customer experience. And then the last step, we recommend an alternative based on our results and a consideration of these factors. Okay. For the last few minutes here, we're going to move on to other cost effectiveness evaluation methods. And I'm going to start with lowest reasonable costs. So as I had mentioned earlier on, the key difference between benefit cost analysis and lowest reasonable cost, best fit analysis is that for lowest reasonable cost, the need for the investment has already been established. And the objective is really to minimize the utility regulatory requirement while making sure that the utility meets grid needs. So the table here on this slide walks through the differences between the two methods as it relates to the need, where I just mentioned the need for lowest reasonable cost. For benefit cost analysis, the need hasn't been established. We're trying to determine whether it should be made. If we're looking at examples of when we might apply one to the other, we would usually see lowest reasonable costs for investments like grid expenditures required to maintain reliable operations or to integrate distributed energy resources. If we're replacing distribution poles, we're not going to do a benefit cost analysis on each of the poles or on the portfolio of poles. We're going to be the need for replacing the poles has been determined, and we're seeing how we can do that most effectively or with the lowest reasonable cost. For benefit cost analysis, an example of this that you'll see out there is advanced metering infrastructure. Should we make the investment in advanced metering infrastructure? Will the benefits that this can bring outweigh the costs of the meters and of replacing the meters in the future? And should we do the analysis? So that's a typical example of benefit cost analysis. So multi-criteria decision analysis is another tool for assessing alternatives. It's particularly useful when there's multiple conflicting objectives or when some criteria are difficult or impossible to monetize. So for example, if one objective is to have projects that align with a policy like transportation electrification, then scoring an alternative based on a scale versus a dollar amount might make more sense. These types of analyses usually follow a process of determining a set of criteria. We're determining the weighting of each criterion. We're scoring each alternative along the criterion and then calculating the total weighted score. So this table here is an illustrative example again of how we might do this. We have across the top the different criteria, which here for illustrative purposes are reliability, sustainability, electrification, and equity. Within each column, within each of those criterion, we have a weight, and the weight reflects the importance relative to the other criteria. For reliability, it's 0.4. For sustainability, 0.2. Electrification is 0.1, and then equity is 0.25. And then for each alternative, as we go down the table, we see the score that we would determine based on a particular scale. And let's say this one is 1 to 5, or 0 to 5. Given that the perspectives are incorporated through the weighting of the different policy objectives, it is important to gain understanding and agreement among stakeholders going into the analysis, what criteria will be used, what scoring methodology would be used, and so that the results can be accepted when the analysis is done. And finally, this slide looks at value spend efficiency, which is another tool for multi-criteria decision analysis. The table here, the difference between what we have here and in the last table is that value spend efficiency incorporates the cost of the alternatives into the final score, or the spend efficiency metric. So that table down at the bottom there is identical to the table that we had on the last slide, but the alternative with the highest score, which was alternative A, that also has the highest costs, $5 million. So the spend efficiency just takes that total score, divides by the total cost, you get a normalized spend efficiency, and then this really allows you to compare between different alternatives to see where we can get the biggest bang for our buck. Applications of this kind of test could be distribution expenditure plans to make sure that for a given amount of money that we're achieving our highest value per dollar expended. And with that, I am happy to take any questions in the last few minutes.
Great, thanks so much, Myles. Yeah, we have some time. We do have one question in the chat, and that's, can you share resources that present robust criteria for optimally selecting discount rates for practical forecasts and net present value evaluations? And so, this is something that you might follow up in the chat box, or we might send out through DOE to the fellows in follow up. But is there anything, can you think of some criteria maybe to share with us right now? And then we can maybe follow up with some resources.
If we're looking at robust criteria for selecting a discount rate, generally, I think, there are standard practice manuals for performing these cost effectiveness tests. There's the National Standard Practice Manual, which is referenced in these slides, and that was from 2020, and it looks at how to do benefit cost analysis or cost effectiveness tests for distributed energy resources. The table that I showed in the slides was adapted from that resource. So they really discuss how you would come up with these tests and how you might, it gives more detail on the kinds of discount rates that you can use. But I think, I'm not sure, I'm happy to follow up afterwards. I think I'd mentioned that, if you're looking at it from the perspective of the utility and what the utility should invest in, then looking at what their cost of capital is would be an appropriate discount rate. Whereas, if you have an investment where you're really trying to, look at benefits to society, then that discount rate might not be the appropriate one. And you might want to choose one that's lower. And so you're valuing those future benefits at a higher rate. In terms of those precise values for the discount rate, I think that looking at other analyses, other cost effectiveness tests, I know that the New York utilities had all come out with their own benefit cost analysis guides where they outline all the different factors that they'll use. What's the value of statistical life? What are customer interruption costs? So they give, a lot of times these states will give guidance on what kinds of, not only what tests to use, but then also what the variables are that go into the analysis.
Great, thanks, Myles. I put I put the National Standard Practice Manual citation in the chat. It's also in your slides, which are posted. You also included a resource that Tim Wolf and I worked on, which was specific to grid modernization investments. And we do discuss discount rate in there as well. It's funny, I told Myles, hey, there's so much on the discount rate in your presentation, but it's great that you had a question about it. Feel free to raise your hand. I can call you, but I did think that it would be useful for you to talk a little bit more about, because I think you know, the sensitivity analyses are so important because we don't know what the future will hold. And so, you know, these are our best guesses. So how do you use the results that come out of Monte Carlo analysis? Like, what are the risk measures that you get from it? You know, what's your favorite one? I have my favorite one. Because I think, you know, it's one thing to say like, yeah, do the analysis. And then what do I do? The utility gives me the results. And which ones do I look at? There are all these different metrics.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. I think when you're looking at doing analyses related to climate, right, there's always some underlying distribution or underlying set of uncertainties that will, you know, that researchers have come up with for defining the probability of a storm or the probability of certain damages. They all have these really long tails out into the future. And so, you know, to the extent that you're doing an analysis where, you know, this type of you're dealing with this type of risk, you want to get a sense of how that long tail impacts the results of the analysis that you're doing.
And so by tail, you mean like the worst outcomes? Yes,
exactly. The worst outcomes. So many are around the middle where you might get, you know, if your distribution has a big middle, then you might get a lot of, you know, a lot of probabilities that are around the average. And a lot of the times, you know, you'll see analyses that just look at that average value. Let's say the, you know, probability is 0.5. But if you have these long tails and there's a small chance that you could have a large negative impact, then there's strategies that you can take to hedge. You know, if you have a series of different strategies, you know, there's a whole field of decision making under deep uncertainty. So you might have, if the uncertainty about what happens to, you know, with climate change, if that uncertainty is going to impact the results of your analysis based on the strategy that you take, then you might choose a strategy where it performs okay across a whole bunch of different potential, you know, future outcomes, as opposed to just saying like, we think it's going to be this, and we'll pick the strategy that performs best here. So
we did get another question in. We just have 2 minutes left, but the last slide on value spend efficiency seems to be an application of a weighted decision matrix. How does the approach change when the applications of the product of the weights and the scores change as the weights approach the extremes?
So as we increase the weights for, I'm not sure I fully understand that question, but
yeah, John, if you want to unmute yourself, and maybe clarify the question.
Yep. You know, the weighted decision matrix, which I think is what that's based on, always sounds great in concept, but whenever I've run through it with a group engineering team, I've always doubted the results. And so while like kind of minor perturbations about the means of the data sets are fine, that you kind of touched on earlier, but the question is more on the lines of what happens when you start to look at the results and you say this doesn't make sense, or the extremes become so pronounced, not in a negative sense where you're just talking about the impacts of climate change, but the positives of one project are in different categories, the positives of another. Right?
Well,
if you're unwilling to accept that you're not touching on a domain with one project, how do you then apply that same model to quantify your decision?
I mean, I think I would answer that just by saying that these are the kinds of tools, and it's important just going in. Like if you are using this tool and it doesn't seem like it fits given the objectives of what you're doing, then there's ways of modifying this kind of tool so that it does make sense. I think in a case like this, value spend efficiency, you see You know, in just public policy, this is really just looking at, you know, what's the cost effectiveness of several different options. You may have, in the utility space, there's also risk spend efficiency. So how do you reduce risk by the most per dollar? I've seen cases, you know, for something like value spend efficiency, where you may need to, you may normalize the different weighting and scoring options. And you may also, you know, if the objective of your approach is to get, you know, a more balanced, you know, more balanced, addressing all those different criteria in a more balanced way. So like, you wouldn't want a whole bunch of things that maybe only did reliability, and you didn't address any of the other projects or any of the other criteria. Then you just need to be able to take a step back from the tool, maybe not read the results, you know, just and take that as gospel, and maybe you know, use it to inform your decision. I'm not sure I answered that, you know, to your satisfaction there, but I can follow.
I think it did. It's a tough question. So thank you, Bill.
We're past time. Thanks so much to everyone who joined. Thanks for all to all our presenters. Again, if you haven't already registered for the September 26th training on grid resilience, please do. You've gotten the email, I think, from DOE a couple of times. I put the link in the chat box, and we look forward to the next webinar. Until then, take care.